Hello everyone, my name is Stephen Redman. Welcome to Pastor's Library. This is the channel where we discuss everything to do with theology books. This will be the start of a few videos looking back on systematic theology. I know it's something that drives a lot of you, and looking at my bookshelf, it must either drive me or I'm crazy. So I wanted to just raise a couple of issues. And fundamentally, what we're going to get to is we're going to compare one version of a systematic theology that has been highly popular with its new highly popular update. So I want to start with Louis Berkhof. This systematic theology is my 1969 reprint. I don't know quite how long I've had it, but I've had it a long time. And when I first came across this, Louis Berkhof was the only systematic theology that I was aware of. I had seen it on bookshelves of people that had in common one thing. They'd all been to the Bible college that was not too far away from us, either geographically or theologically. I sort of thought Louis Berkhof was the only person that wrote systematic theology. I looked in this and I found it challenging. I don't mean challenging to believe it, I found it challenging in the way it was delivered, the way it was presented. And there were things in here which I thought, well, I don't recognise that as being God. And so Louis Berkhof, whereas I've had it a long time, it's something that I would say that I only ever use for comparison purposes with something that I prefer. So there are lots of systematic theologies out there which have changed because of time. And I don't even think Louis Berkhof would have written it the way he's written it then, where he's doing it now. Because I grew up in a classical Pentecostal church, when I was talking to people about systematic theology, they said, oh, well, of course, what you want is Stanley Horton. This is the Systematic Theology, a revised edition, available on CD-ROM. This one was a fifth printing in 2007. Now, this is a systematic theology which I wouldn't really recommend today, even for Pentecostal people. Not that it's terribly wrong about anything, but it's simply insufficient for the modern reader. I don't think this covers all the things that it should do. There are much better systematics out there. So whether you're looking at a Reformed situation like Berkhof or a Pentecostal situation like Horton, what I'm saying is they maybe were good in their day, but there are much, much better ones now. So what about what has been, I think, the best-selling systematic in the last 30 years, and that's Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology, subtitled An Introduction to Biblical Doctrine. And, of course, that is really a good subtitle because that is what systematic theology is broadly about. It's about things that you want to believe and someone presenting them in a manner that you can sign up for. And Systematic Theology was first printed, this edition, in 1994. And Wayne Grudem is a really interesting guy, considering he's sold so many of these. He sort of upsets as many people as he pleases, really. Now, I'm not a Wayne Grudem fan, but I did get a lot from this. And I think, I don't know how many times I'm going to end up saying it on this channel, but if you can't get something from people that you disagree with, I don't think you're reading properly. I'm not saying that you should pick up something printed by the Jehovah's Witnesses and read that because it's going to be different to what you believe as a Christian. But I'm talking about people coming from a different theological background, a different background of denomination or network. And these people can sometimes offer you something which will either open your eyes or maybe even just help you see really that you had got a great idea and a great understanding already, and their different position convinces you of your own. And all of these things are very valid. I think Wayne Grudem, who I would describe as a reformed charismatic, which is not always a common situation. In the UK, we have one broad denomination, one broad network that is Reformed charismatic. But in general, people would read Wayne Grudem because he was a charismatic, or they would read him because he was Reformed. But of course, a lot of Reformed people find charismatic theology a bit reprehensible. And so this was never really everybody's cup of tea. And yet in 1994, over 300,000 copies were in print. I don't know quite how many he has sold, but let me say, as it was coming up for 30 years old, he had to get an update out there quick. And Systematic Theology 2nd edition came out in 2020. And this is a whole different kettle of fish. Now, what am I saying? Well, the first edition from 1994 was 1,291 pages. The second edition from 2020, so we're talking 26 years later, just nicely under the 30-year rule, has got 1,586 pages. That's an extra 295 pages. That's a lot of growth. And I would suggest to you that the number of differences in this is quite remarkable. Like, for example, if you go into the preface, at one point he says, some people have said to him, have you changed your mind about anything? And his answer is, very little, but there are a few changes. And then when he goes into it, these very little changes actually do add up to a certain amount of realistic change. He now affirms the doctrine of God's impassibility in the sense of incapable of suffering harm, meaning that he says he had mistakenly failed to consider in the first edition. He also thinks that John 3:16 should be translated a bit differently now, as only begotten. And he also has changed his view about the age of the earth and creationism, and now goes along with some of the scientific numbers that the earth is X billion years old and the universe is even X squared billion years old. And none of those things are in themselves terribly wrong, but he has started to change some things, and we'll hit some of those ideas later. What's this book do with its extra 290 odd pages? Well, of course, as you would expect, it's got completely updated bibliographies. Now, it's very important that in every section here there is a bibliography, and some of these bibliographies are extremely good. There are some weaknesses in them. For example, it is very good at referring to other systematic theologies that come from a doctrinal position that is askew from his own. And I admire him for that, actually. I think that is really positive. But, for example, he has one Pentecostal and charismatic systematics, and whereas he has the great J. Rodman Williams there at the top of his list, that is getting a bit aged now. And he doesn't really have any of the main ones that have come out in the last sort of 15 years or so. You would have expected Vonne and Macchia and people like that to have get on the list. So I think that's a little bit inadequate, but I'm just slightly worried that what he is comparing with are the least good systematics in their own field, rather than comparing best with best. So there you have it. He's also changed all the Bible quotes from RSV to ESV, which tells you a little bit about where he is in his own journey. And he has got some more articles on other theologies. For example, there's quite a section on openness in this. He's also got something on Mormonism. So things like that have been affected. There are additional verses considered under the biblical inerrancy issues, the verses that he didn't look at before, and lots of others really. But I think that it's important that we understand that the man has got a lot of integrity. He's worked hard to finish this, because before he started this, he had a Parkinson's diagnosis, and fortunately it has been a slow progressing disease and has not held him up that much. So he has during that time not only published this total update, but also a book on Christian ethics as well. And the design of this is that in each section there are questions for personal application. There's the bibliography that I mentioned. There's a memory passage, and there are traditional and contemporary worship songs. Now, there was a hymn in the previous one. There was questions in the other one. There was bibliography in the other one, memory passage. But the idea of having a contemporary worship song as well as a traditional one will, I would have thought, helped him in some fields. Because the truth is, I may have been brought up with the redemption hymnal, and when we had some of our young people in the service on Sunday play an old hymn, I knew the words, and it was great to sing along. But the truth is, most of the songs that we sing are not out of the old hymn books, and I'm very, very comfortable with that. It doesn't mean I reject those old songs. It's just that I like new songs, new cries from the heart. So I think that's a useful tool. Now, what I would say is that the endorsements for this book, it's supported by some of the most extreme determinists on the planet. And I'm not going to say who they are. You can read that yourself if you want to have a look. To me, it was a little bit like getting a good Christian book reviewed by Adolf Hitler and comparing it with Mein Kampf. Well, I struggle with some of these extreme determinists. I really do. Some of them, I think, really bring the gospel into disrepute. But that is a personal view, and I'm not asking you to join me in that position. So, just to go through some of the pages I've marked in this, he does recognise that there has been an explosion of systematic theology texts. And let's be honest about it, there's a heck of a lot of them. I sometimes see a systematic theology that I haven't read, and I think, oh, that looks interesting. And I put it into my basket on the internet, and before I realise, I've clicked that I've bought it. And then when I come, I think, where's this going to fit? I've got 3 shelves full of systematic theology, and they're packed. Where am I going to put that? And sometimes, I think particularly with systematic theology, I think even I have overdone it. But there are things that I think are good to pick up from some of the latest writers, some of the latest authors. And of course, if you are writing essays for university, for Bible college use, you will in the main need to represent items in the last 30 years. And so that is always a good thing to look at. So I think one thing that's changed a fair bit in his writings are his issues with impassibility and immutability. Now, immutability is about God not changing, and impassibility is about God not experiencing emotion or suffering. And I think it's quite interesting in that some of his definitions have become a little woolly. Now, I like them a bit woolly in this particular area, but some people might find that a little awkward. For example, when it comes to unchangeableness, he says God is unchanging in his being, perfections, purposes and promises, yet God does act and feel emotions, and he acts and feels differently in response to different situations. Now, that's a little bit different to what it was 26 years ago, but I actually prefer his modern definition. And as we go through this, we'll see when he talks about God changing his mind, he'll say, does God then change his mind? It depends on what you mean by that. And when someone says that, I want to say, come on, nail your colours to the mast, man. It's not enough to say it depends what you mean by that. But what he tries to do with that is say that when a situation changes, such as when people repent or pray or both, God often in Scripture changes his present attitude towards the specific situation. But God's long-term purposes never change. I find that a little bit like I'm going to bury my head in the sand so that when I speak, all you will hear is a muffled and I think really that's a little bit of where he's going with that. He also says that impassibility should not be understood to mean that God does not have passions or emotions, for certainly God does feel emotions. He rejoices, he's grieved, his wrath burns hot, he pities his children, he loves with everlasting love, all of those things and more. However, there is another sense of impassibility that I mistakenly failed to consider this in the first edition of the book. Impassible can mean immunity to suffering or incapable of suffering harm. God's being cannot be changed or harmed by anything outside of himself. Now, this, of course, is a well-structured sentence because Jesus did suffer horrendously and terribly, but it was in his own purpose and in the will of his own will and in God's will. And so he says a few things about that and says, so in a sense, God is impassible. He then talks a bit more about process theology than he did in the last edition. And he says that process theologians dislike the doctrine of God's immutability because they think it implies that nothing we do will ever really matter to God. And I'm glad he has a bit of a go at process theology because I do believe process theology is very, very dangerous. And I think that it's not helpful, which is why I have half a dozen books written by the main people who wrote the ideas, and I've read them because I want to understand how dangerous this is. So, this is, if you say, process theology, well, I'm never going to read about that because I believe it's heresy. Well, I think that's like saying, I don't want ever to be shot, so I'm never going to wear a bulletproof vest. I think, that there are ways of preparing yourself. He also says that the other fundamental error in process theology is assuming that God must be changeable like the universe he created. So there are things in there that are useful to know. I think the section on omniscience is useful. And again, he defines omniscience in a way which I think is covering his own back. He says, God fully knows himself and all things actual and possible in one simple and eternal act. Now, why do I say that? Well, you see, some people, and in fact he'll go on in open theism, he will say open people believe that if God knows everything that will happen, how can our choices be fully free? And he says that in general, open people will talk about contingent acts of free moral agents, where contingent means possible but not certain. And he says that basically God cannot know what a man has not yet decided because it hasn't been fully formed. And he particularly quotes Richard Rice, which is a very prominent author in this field. And whereas I would never sign up to openness, I do think open theology offers the best clarity on all of the other positions. And by all of the other of them, I would say there are 5 key theologies that are about the nature of God. There is determinism, or sometimes people would call it Calvinism, Wesleyan Arminianism, which most people these days will call free will theism. There is relational theology, and there are two very different theologies that go under that name. The American one, which is Tom Ord, and the British one, which is the late Roger Forster. And these two theologies are quite different, believe me. But then there's openness and there's process theology. And, people say to me, well, Calvinism, the opposite of Calvinism is Arminianism. Well, actually, no, the opposite is process theology, because that's the furthest away from the image of God that determinism or Calvinism shares. So I think that what he tells us about openness is very fair and even-handed, but I've noticed that some of his definitions are becoming a little bit loose so as not to be quite so offensive to other people, really. But I don't think he's done that badly or underhandedly. I think he's gaining a lot of wisdom. What I would say is that whereas this would never be my favourite systematic, in fact that would be not by a long chalk, I recognise that this version 2, revised edition of Systematic Theology by Wayne Grudem, that this is quite largely better than the original one. I would now no longer really pick up the old one, except to compare it with the new, because the new one is infinitely better. But will it satisfy the Reformed people? Will it satisfy the Charismatics? Well, it might not satisfy either, but it will be of interest to both sides. And I think if you are a Reformed Charismatic, then you will probably be over the moon with it. So I think that a lot of changes have been made in this. I think that it's an awful lot better. And if you want to read what the other half believe, so to speak, I would suggest it's a very good place to start. And when I do read this, I find he and I agree on, 75%, 80% plus of everything. But the rest of it is something that I can largely accommodate, and it gives me at least some insight into people from his side of the tree, so to speak, into what they know and what they believe. And let's be fair about it. Wayne Grudem is a man of substance, a man of great qualities, and it may be that he's not my number one hero, but he has written an extremely good book here, something which would help you in your journey through systematic theology, whatever direction you come from. So that's it for today. In the next few weeks, I've got a couple more of these where we're looking at a comparison just between a small number of systematics, and I hope it will help you, so keep your eyes out for that. And until next time, all I've got to say to you is bye!